Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo están todos? Estamos ya en vivo aquí directo en YouTube y LinkedIn. Bienvenidos a todos los que nos están sintonizando. Gracias por estar aquí. Estoy en este momento con Mike Adams, que está del otro lado del mundo, está en Australia, nos está acompañando para, para platicar un poquito sobre cómo poder usar historias para nuestros procesos de negocio, para ser más efectivos, para llegar a más, para conectar mejor, para lograr más empatía. Mike ha estado con Anecdote desde hace ya tiempo y él es el encargado de todo el programa que se llama Story Powered Sales, que es un programa del que vamos a hablar en un momento más. Es un programa increíble del que en Astrolab somos socios y estamos asociados para impartir este programa en México y en Latinoamérica, la versión en español. Hemos estado muy contentos de esta sociedad, digamos. Y pues en este caso estoy aquí con Mike. Mike, how are you?
Very well, thanks, Oscar. Lovely to be with you.
Thanks for being here. How's everything over Australia?
Everything is, well, up until 2 weeks ago, it was pretty good in Australia. We got our coronavirus cases down very low. And right now in Victoria, where I live, is going back up again. So now we have a massive effort to get it under control, So I think I was in Europe in February this year. I noticed the coronavirus thing getting worse and worse. In fact, I was planned to fly back to Australia via Hong Kong, and I was in Paris, and I decided I would be safer not to come back via Hong Kong. So I ended up changing my flight. I flew back via the Middle East, and our family went into lockdown a week or so after that. 6 of us in the family. Actually, I have 3 boys. They're adult boys, so 23, 24, 26. And we had one of the boys' girlfriends, 6 of us in the house. And we had a pretty easy lockdown, I have to say. I built a rock climbing wall in our garage, and we went rock climbing every day. So it wasn't too tough. But maybe we're going to go back into lockdown again because it's getting out of control just where we are living. The rest of Australia, pretty good. Okay. What about you, Oscar? You're safe and sound.
Yeah, but it's the same over here, right? We also were into the lockdown, and then people started going out, and also it's going up again. So we're getting back to our houses.
Yeah, so, it seems like in Australia the numbers we have are much lower than you have in Mexico and in North America. So we have something like. With the worst, we had, I think, 128 new cases yesterday, which is very high for us, but I think you have much more. But we try to suppress completely. And yes, I don't know what's going to happen. I think we will probably succeed to suppress completely, but it has a very strong economic effect. It's really shutting down our business. And this is the difficult thing to manage. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And actually, I have some questions on that point. I wanted to start by asking, have you seen people or teams building trust in their brands, products, or services, even in these uncertain times? And how are they managing it? How are they doing it?
Yes, that's an interesting question. When we first went into lockdown, I was a little bit scared to even ring up my clients because, I knew that they were probably worried more about their families and their personal situation than their work. It seems a little bit not very sympathetic to just try to talk about work. So in fact, when I did ring people up, I wasn't talking about work at all. It was more, how are you and how are things going with you, and having a conversation that's a little bit more important than just business. And I think that's what most of our clients have been doing too. So they've been ditching their sales scripts. And let's face it, Oscar, those sales scripts don't work anyway. That those ways of speaking like a salesperson, they don't work. Everybody's heard the selling pitch before. They don't like it much. I think it's even worse now when someone calls you up or when someone contacts you by email and they're obviously trying to sell something because you don't know what is their situation. Maybe that's impossible for them to buy. And it's just, it's just irritating when people are like that. And I think this is one of the real clues with storytelling, because we don't try to teach salespeople exactly what to say.
Okay.
And I don't think you can. I don't think you can. A conversation is too complicated. We don't teach them ask this question and then wait for this kind of answer and then ask this question, because it doesn't work. But if we teach salespeople how to just tell a relevant story and then watch what is the impact of that story on the face of their client and listen, tend for the story that comes back, then it's a different conversation immediately. It's a much more natural conversation. So if I tell a story about something that's happened to me or to one of my clients, and then say, well, enough about me, what about you? And listen to the story that comes back and ask questions about it, and really just, we call it tending. We attend to their story. This creates a connection and it makes a different kind of conversation. I'm not going to ask them what keeps them up at night or what special challenge they have. We're just going to exchange stories and and focus on their story. Listen carefully to their story and notice the character in that story and the decisions they make and how they feel. And then we get a connection this way. So it's the opposite, really, of the pushy salesperson.
Yeah, of course. And how do you open it? Like, first, do you have some icebreakers first, or do you open with the story first?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm meeting someone new for the first time, I have to think about what story might be interesting to them. But you can't be for sure. You can't know for certain. So what I do is I just tell them
Okay.
that story. And I have several that I tell. Sometimes I tell people how I got started in sales. So I tell them that I didn't want to be in sales because I'm an electrical engineer, and engineers, we hate sales. In fact, we hate salespeople and we hate sales as a general rule. And but my boss, back in the 90s, my boss said, Mike, I had this great career opportunity, and you can go to Norway. I was working in England. And he said, you can go to Norway. And I said, yes, I want to go to Norway, but you have to be a salesperson. I said, no, I don't want to be a salesperson. And what I actually said to him was, look, my wife is 8 months pregnant, so I can't go to Norway. It's impossible. And then I went home and she said, oh, I really want to go to Norway. So we went, that's how I got into sales, right? And that little story is interesting, right? So it sort of has some surprise in it, but it also has something personal, right? I told my client that my wife was 8 months pregnant. And when I tell that story, they very, very often tell me about when their wife was pregnant or when their partner was pregnant or about their kids or something. And this story has a connecting capability, let's put it.
Of course.
So I would just tell that story, and then I might say to them, well, enough about me. How did you get into procurement? And they will tell their story back. So that's kind of how it works, right? It's not a very exact formula. It's just tell your story and then ask them for their story and see what happens. And what happens usually is your 30-minute meeting became 90-minute meeting because you spent all your time exchanging stories.
Yeah, of course.
And you got to know each other. And it's you could call that a formula if you like, but it's not a formula of ask this question, then ask this question, then ask this question, because this one, of course, the client feels like they're being trapped with these questions. They don't like those questions much, and they've heard them before, right, from 1,000 other salespeople, and it's
exactly
not very interesting and doesn't really work. And by the way, it's also not what the very best salespeople do in every company. The very best salespeople do not ask those kind of questions. And it's interesting to observe the very best sales. The very best salespeople are usually don't have the business card salesperson. Their business card is usually founder or division manager or head of marketing. You know, that they're a different business card, right? These are people who learnt by accident how to sell. And these people, invariably, they tell stories. Sometimes they don't stop. Sometimes their other staff are just rolling their eyes because they don't stop and they heard all those stories 100 times before. But they're very effective storytellers, and they're often unconscious. They don't even know they're doing it. They don't know that's what they do. Right? So
actually, now you say that, I've seen those kind of salespeople sell in other places that are not offices, right? Like they sell in parties or in social gatherings or
That's right. That's right. And it's naturally very engaging. They're interesting people, and that they're able to sell because they can go deep, right? Like I cannot sell you anything, Oscar, until a couple of things happen. First, you have an idea who I am and you kind of trust me, right? If you don't trust me, I think you got your barrier up, right? And second, we have a conversation about some problem that you would like to solve. And you trust me to make a contribution to that problem. I mean, I don't think salespeople really solve the problem for their client. Clients solve their own problems themselves. But if I could tell you a story about another client that solved their problem, and you could imagine yourself as that other client, and then I say to you, well, Oscar, you know, that's them. You're probably different. What about you? What's going on in your company? And you start telling me the story about the problems you're trying to solve. Then we can start to work together, right? Because we understand each other. You understand that I know something, not everything. I understand you know something. You don't know everything. You need a little bit of help. And we work together and we solve a problem together, right? But that story exchange is what got us there. So one of the things we have to teach salespeople is how to collect their success stories and tell their success stories in a way that the other client would like to listen. And it's not case studies, because vendor case studies are not very interesting for your prospects, because we tend to make our case studies, we make us the hero. We make the vendor company the hero in this case study. And they don't start, you know, they sound like, here was our other client in the big, I don't know if I can say this in Mexico, in the shit. And they in the shit. And we came along and we fixed it for them, right? And now everything's wonderful. Well, this is not a very good story for your other prospect, right? You think I'm stupid, right? It's not the right approach, right? We need to be able to tell the success story a different way. So that's what we teach. We teach salespeople just how to tell a story the right way, the success story the right way, and then say, well, what about you? How's things going on over there?
Yeah, I think this is great to open a conversation and even to open the head of the prospect and to share this kind of problems. And can you share an example or some cases when you get to the point where you get to the difficult point where you get to manage objections or something like some arguments you have to battle, and especially this time where you get to talk about, for example, budget or other difficult areas, and how you manage to get through that.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, Oscar, you're interested in once we get to what seems like the client is not believing what we're saying, or they don't really understand what we're saying, right? So one of those two things, right? So we're stuck.
Exactly. You start great. You start with the personal and maybe some relational stories, and you're great until then. But when you get to the point that you have to talk about the business, something starts to happen, and you see a different dynamic.
Okay. So let's create a hypothetical situation for a sales team. Suppose I'm talking to a sales leader, and the sales leader says to me, Mike, it's not going to work teaching our sales guys storytelling because salespeople are lazy and they're egotistical. They think they already know how to sell. And the best way to get salespeople to sell more is to put a target on them and push and crack the whip and fire a few of them if they don't perform, and they will perform. We don't need to teach them any storytelling. So when I'm hearing something like that, this does not agree with what I believe, but this person has this belief for some reason. And I could choose one of two options. One is to try to change their belief, and the other is to try to understand why they believe that. And the great way to understand why someone believes something is with story listening. It's to try to find the story. We need to ask a different type of question. So at the beginning, I told you all those classic sales questions don't work, but there is a type of question that really does work. And that's the type of question that leads to a story. So I would maybe ask, I would say, wow, you have a pretty low opinion of the motivation of salespeople. Could you give me an example of where salespeople have let you down, or where you have seen them only respond when I'm trying to get into their world and get them to tell me a story. Could you tell me exactly when you saw that happen? And then I'm getting a story from them, and I'm starting to understand their world a little bit better. And then maybe, sometimes people, they just have a wrong belief. And what I might do if I think, okay, they've just had a bad experience, they've never had the good experience of when salespeople worked in a motivated way. So then I might use what we call an influence story. And the influence story has three parts to it. It has an acknowledgement. Okay. So we would say, look, I understand how you feel. I understand because salespeople have let you down like that you feel that you have to crack the whip and just put them on targets and fire them if they're not achieving them. You rule by fear. I can understand you feel that way. And then I would tell a story about when that is not true. For example, I might tell them a story about when I worked for a couple of companies that didn't have that approach. They had the approach of coaching and teaching salespeople how to work and how wonderful the sales results were. I could tell them the story of when I was working in Schlumberger or in Nokia, when we had a different approach and it really worked. And then at the end of that, I would say, so you see, it's not always true that salespeople have to be pushed and you have to motivate them by fear. You can also expand their minds and motivate them by learning and by being good at their job and by job satisfaction. So now I'm using a story to give them a new experience, because we can only learn things two ways. We can learn things by direct experience. And in this case, the sales leader, let's say, had a direct experience that made them believe something. The second way to learn something, which is actually how we learn most of the things in our mind, is to learn from other people's stories. So I can give a story that gives you a different experience. And then usually I have to wait a little bit of time for them to think about that story and to go, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe we try that, So this is a way to change the mind of someone who has a strong belief. Firstly, try to understand by hearing their story. Secondly, give them examples, give them story examples of when that wasn't true, when their wrong belief was not right. So you see, stories can help you in both directions, by pull, by getting their story, and by push, by giving their story. Yeah,
of course. And actually talking about that, if salespeople are feeling probably overwhelmed or very anxious about this context, like I don't know, I've encountered a lot of teams that are feeling like stuck, right? How would you help them discover these new skills and tell them that this is a great way to push them through, to develop their careers, like to get to another level?
Yeah. All conversation skills are things that we learn through practice, right? And usually with any skill that's a little bit difficult, we have to unlearn some bad habits, and then we have to learn some better habits. Some people can do that with by reading. So this is my book. You can see. You can read books, and it's not the only good book. Mike Bosworth wrote a good book too on sales storytelling. So what great salespeople do. So you can read about it. I have a YouTube channel with lots of story examples. So you can listen to story examples, and they're essentially the story types that we teach are situational. So if you're in this situation, you tell this type of story. So you asked me. Sorry.
How can people find your channel? Just to
Story Powered Sales. Story Powered Sales is the name of the YouTube channel, so they can find it like that. If they're in a sales team and there are sales leaders listening, then we run and you guys run for us our course, Story Powered Sales, and that one is that is an in-depth course on using stories. So we do the unlearning and the learning in that, and we have a very interesting teaching process. So and we learned something interesting, Oscar, when we went into lockdown, because the last workshop I did face-to-face was in Cambridge in England in February this year. And I was traveling through Europe, and our approach before lockdown was we would do a one-day workshop, and then we would do some coaching after the workshop for story practice. And because I was traveling, we couldn't start the story practice for a couple of weeks. And when I went to start with that team in Cambridge, only half of them turned up for the practice. And then we used video messaging for the practice, which and only half of the half decided to practice their stories. So it was a pretty poor result, a little bit my fault. But then when we went into lockdown and we had to deliver our course virtually, we split the one day into 4 sessions, and we had 1 or 2 days between the sessions. And people would send their story by video message between the sessions. And the very first story we do is you telling somebody else's story to help that person, to help that other person. So the salesperson is thinking, okay, I'm not doing it for myself. I don't need any training, because that's most salespeople. They don't need training, but I need to help out that other guy. So I send that story, right? So they get a little bit of practice telling a story, and they get some practice with the video message, so they see how it works. And then we do 2 more story types with the video practice. And so I've done several corporate sales teams since we've been in lockdown, and several public ones. And we get close to 100% of the salespeople doing their story, because we split it up, right? And then we do a little competition. And I don't say this is a competition to prove how good you are. This is a competition to contribute stories to the story bank. And we get really good participation. Of course, they want to win because salespeople are competitive, but they also want to contribute their stories because they know they have good stories. And what happens is we give them a bit of time to practice the competition. And if we have 12 salespeople in a team, we get 12 stories. Usually at least 10 of them are good, and we put them straight in the story bank. And our objective that we say to the sales team is not so much, we're going to teach you stories, but we're going to create a library or a bank of stories that everybody in the team can use. And this is where we start to get some institutional change, organizational change in the way people use stories and change their conversation. They don't sound like salespeople when they start telling these stories. And they have a nice collection as well.
That's great. That's a very simple but very effective way to get people to start like with the new mindset, right? Like to find these stories, to rehearse, to tell the stories, and then to record them, right?
That's right. I mean, if we think of the classic sales team, we can split them into 3 groups, in my experience. The first group, which is usually the smaller group, but it could be a larger group. It's people who are new to sales. They know they don't know what to do, and they really want information. Now, unfortunately, most of those people get taught wrong at the beginning. They get taught those old-fashioned questioning techniques, and they get taught the wrong technique, right? But these people are really good students because they want to learn, yeah? And then we have, at the other end, usually a very small group, which are the continuous learners. People who hear about a new technique and they go, I really want to learn how to do that. It's interesting. It's very often the senior managers who join the group are like that. They're senior people, they're pretty good salespeople, and they want to learn more. And then we have this group in the middle, Oscar, who think they know how to sell. They don't want to be told. They want to protect their ego. They're scared. They're scared that if they go into a training course, they might get exposed and not look good. So we really have to think about those people. And what I say is, if you've been successful in selling, most likely you're already telling stories. And they nod, they go, yeah, I tell stories. I'm thinking, well, most likely your stories probably aren't very good, but let's start with that. So you're already telling stories. We want the rest of the team to hear your stories so that we can put them in the story bank. And maybe there's some other stories that you didn't know about yet that you can hear and you can get even better. So it's not that we say they're doing something wrong. They're probably doing something right because they've already been successful. But here's a way to get even better and for everybody to learn from what you know. And it's a better way. It's a smarter way to work.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Can you share an example of a company that you think that it's been great at embedding this process or this techniques to their process?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Because I'm an engineer, I'm very concerned about effectiveness. Does it really work? And there's a little bit of a problem with teaching this kind of conversation technique because it's hard to prove that the story did the work. And it's hard to even know for sure, did the salespeople tell stories after you did the training? So it's not an easy question. But there's one company, Oscar, that I worked with when I started in sales consulting back in 2015. So I've been working for very big corporations like Siemens and Nokia, and these really big conglomerate companies. And when I started on my own, I did all kinds of training for salespeople. I wanted to change how salespeople talk, but when I started, I also taught the old-fashioned questioning techniques. Right? It took me a while to realize that it didn't work, and I did this little experiment. I rang up like 100 people that I'd taught and got them to tell me what they remembered from my training, and it was like they remembered zero. Some of them even told me they remembered something I hadn't taught them. Right? Right? But they did remember the stories. They remembered stories I told them, so they told me back stories, and that's when I okay, it has to be stories. But this one company I started with, their salespeople were not degree qualified people. They were tradespeople, and they were selling property services like fire warden training. So how to evacuate a building if there's a fire, right? So they were selling this kind of service. And I started with the salespeople, and I found it really hard to teach them anything. They had very ingrained conversation habits. They would keep speaking the same way. It didn't matter what I taught them, right?
Yeah.
And then I started including their managers in the training. And then I met back with one of the managers, and he said to me, Mike, you taught us all those stories, and there's one story that you taught us that I use several times per week. I use it often, almost every time I meet a new client, a potential client. And this story was not even from Australia and not even from their company, right? Because they're selling fire warden training. And I found a story from when the planes hit the Twin Towers in 9/11 of the safety manager for Morgan Stanley Bank. His name is Rick Rescorla. And Rick Rescorla was an ex-Marine, and they had 20 floors from floor 60 up to 80 something in Tower 2 in New York. And he was doing evacuation training for 3,000 people, and they hated it. They absolutely hated him, and they hated it. But he was a very diligent guy, right? Yeah. And when the Tower 1 got hit, he was monitoring the port radio, the New York Harbor port radio. And they said there's some kind of explosion. Everybody has to stay in their office for Tower 2, right? You have to stay in your office. And he's like, no, we're out of here. We're gone. So he went to his fire. He had fire wardens on every floor, announced to them we're evacuating. And the Morgan Stanley people were halfway down when their tower got hit. And all the lights went out and dust came down the stairwells and people started panicking. And he had trained his people to how to calm them down and to sing songs and to keep them calm. And when they got down to the bottom, they did a count. And there were 2,890 something of them. They counted them. And there were 20 missing. And the fire wardens, including Rick, they went back up looking for the 20. And those guys didn't make it, right? They didn't make it. Now, my client in Australia, they were telling that story because in Australia, the fire warden training is not compulsory. It's optional. So how to persuade people that you should be prepared for an unlikely event? Well, it turns out that's a very good story. And this guy, so you see, like, it's a really interesting example of a story that's probably made tens of millions of dollars for this Australian company. And so all stories are not equal, right? It's finding those really good stories that really make a difference. And then you go, okay, this story definitely sells, right? This story works. But other than that, it's hard to prove, it's hard to prove that your story works, that it really sells.
Yeah, of course. Actually, the last question that I wanted to ask you was, can you share a story that made a difference in closing a deal? Do you have another one like this, or? Yes.
And I'm going to share it. I'm going to tell you this story because this story illustrates the storytelling process. So I'm the only thing that's kind of unusual about me, about Mike, in my sales career is that I moved from one industry to another industry to another industry, not by planning, because I'd never plan my career, by accident, right? Because I wanted to live in that country, or I wanted to come back home and I needed a new job and I couldn't get one in my old industry. So some things happened to me that caused me to change industry. And it's very interesting when you arrive in a new industry and you don't know anything. How do you sell, right? This is the situation I've been in 5 times. Okay. And when I came back to Australia in late 2011, 2012, I got a job in the facility services industry. I knew nothing about that industry. We were selling catering and cleaning and management of buildings. And my background was telecommunications and software. I've been a technology guy. I'm an engineer. But actually, these are very big deals because my job was to sell to the big mining companies in Western Australia. And they had these enormous camps with thousands of people. In fact, they had, for one of the biggest clients, they had 30,000 people in different towns and camps just in one area in Australia. And my company, my new company was doing all the cleaning and catering and cooking and that kind of stuff for these things. So these deals are worth 10, 20, 30 million dollars per year. And my job was to sell to the biggest mining company there. And I didn't know anything about the industry. So I got an appointment to meet the guy in charge, but I didn't know anything about the business. So I was a little bit worried. What am I going to say? And what I decided to do was to tell him a story about my oil and gas background, because I had worked in the oil and gas industry, but not mining. And I told him a story about actually safety and how very concerned the oil and gas industry is about safety and how that had impacted my career in oil and gas. And then I said, well, enough about me. What about you? How did you get into this huge mining company? And he told me a really interesting connection story first. He said, well, actually, I'm also not from mining. My background is in the army. I worked in the army, and also the army has had lots of problems with safety, and also in mining we have issues with safety, and it's about culture. It's about the culture of safety. So we got talking about that. And then I asked him, so I knew they were coming up for a big tender. The tender was for 5 years of work, $30 million per year. And I asked him, what is the most important, I asked him the classic sales question, what is the most important thing with the tender? And he gave me what we would call a high level answer. He said, Mike, the most important thing in this tender is safety, performance, and safety culture. Now, most salespeople will not ask the deeper question. They will not say why or what is it exactly. I didn't ask the why question because why questions are irritating. If I ask you why is safety important, it's like, well, it should be bloody obvious, right? That's an irritating question. What I asked was, could you give me an example of good or even bad safety performance, something that you don't want to achieve? And he told me the most amazing story. He said yes. And I don't think he would have told this story if I hadn't asked the question that way. He said, recently we had to fire our camp manager, our superintendent on one of the camps, and we had to let go, break the contract of one of the vendor companies because both the vendor and our guy had bonuses on safety performance. So they were going to get bonuses if they got less than a certain number of accidents. And they colluded. They went into an arrangement with each other to hide accidents, to pretend that accidents hadn't happened, and they got caught. And that caused a huge stink, and a lot of people lost their jobs. And that's an example of exactly what we don't want with safety performance, right? Now, when I heard that story, Oscar, I got some real insight into what was important for this guy. And my company didn't understand. My company did not understand how important safety was to him. So I was able to take that story that I heard and tell it back to my client, to my company. And I was new in that company. And what I had told them was, look, guys, we have not put enough emphasis in our bid. And we had already put our first offer in. Our bid is wrong. We have to change our bid. We have to put more profits at risk if we don't hit our targets. And we have to put more money into training our people to be safe and to operate safely. Otherwise, we're not going to win this business. And my company said, well, too late, because we already put our bid in and we can't change it, right? We don't have enough. This is a very low margin business. So late at night, I called back my friend in the mining company, my new friend, who was running the tender. And one of the rules of tendering in these big companies is you don't do that. You don't call them up because you're not allowed to call them up. So I called him up late at night. He was at home. And I said, here's the problem. I understand safety is really important to you, but we've already made a bid and we cannot do these things that you want to do at that price. And he said to me, you have to put your price up. Which is the first and only time a client has ever told me I have to put my price up. So I went back to my company and I said, look, I can't tell you why, but we're going to put our price up. And I persuaded them to put the price up. Put it up quite a bit, actually. It was about 10%. And we won the deal. So we won the deal after putting the price up. And I believe that there were two stories that won that deal. The first was my story about being vulnerable and not knowing the mining industry and explaining a little bit about me, enough for that guy to start to trust me. And the second story was the story he told about safety that persuaded me that we had the wrong bid, that we had bid the wrong thing, and to change our bid and to win that business. So one story told and one story heard is what won that deal. It's a very interesting story, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of a story about the beginnings of Astrolab also. That we also made a proposal, and the client was like, "It's okay, but you need to raise the budget because this is not going to work." So sometimes we're very like scared as salespeople to charge what it is or to put them and sometimes clients don't want that or the money isn't the first important thing, right?
That's right. Money is, at the point that they know what they need to buy, then they want to make sure they're getting a good deal. But most salespeople don't know what the client really wants to buy. So they assume that it's just about the money. And it's very interesting because I've been a sales manager, a sales leader for most of my corporate career. So I've had hundreds of salespeople reporting to me. And when they lose, They always say our price was too high.
Yeah.
100% of the time, right? It's
The
rarely
perfect excuse.
that's the excuse, right? That's the ego-saving excuse, right? The truth is they didn't really understand what the client wanted to buy, and they didn't know what that was worth to the client because they didn't have the tight conversation that they needed to have to make that work. And really what we're teaching is how to have a different kind of conversation, a conversation where we're more trusted, the client trusts us, and they share at a deeper level. They share their stories. We can really only understand our client by hearing their stories. That's the only way we can understand, because we don't work for the client. We don't have the direct experience of being in their company. So we have to hear their stories. And this is what salespeople are not taught. They're not taught how to do that. And it's a big, big difference. And if you have to learn that the slow way, it might take you, like me, it might take you 20 years to figure that out.
Exactly. So I want to open the microphone to people. I don't know if someone that's listening to us live has any question for us. You can use the question if you're in YouTube or LinkedIn, and we're going to see it right here. In the meantime, I wanted to ask you about story-powered sales, the program. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? What if I want to train my team in this? How can I do it?
Yes. So the story-powered sales is a 4-month program. We can't change the way people speak just in a quick training course. We need a bit of time. Our brains need to rewire. We have to change the way we think about the conversation with the client. It takes a little bit of time. So it starts with workshops where we explain the story. We give a little bit of theory, not much, but then we start practicing different types of stories. And then we go to individual practice, private practice. We don't want people to be embarrassed when they try their stories out. So they're sending their stories by video message. Video message is a great way to practice stories. And they send it straight to the instructor. So they send it to Oscar, or they send it to me, whoever is the instructor, and we coach. We coach that. And then when they are happy and we're happy that it's a good story, we put that story as an example in the common feed, in the common video message feed, whether that's Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, whatever it is. But we don't just put the story there, we put the coaching there, because we want them to learn how to coach. I tell you an interesting little story exactly on that point. So I've been coaching an insurance company, Oscar. They're in Hong Kong. Okay. And we did the workshops and the video messaging coaching. And the lady who bought our services, she's the head of distribution and marketing, very, very senior and experienced salesperson and marketing person. She said to me, Mike, we got exactly what I wanted, because the reason I bought this course is our salespeople were sounding like talking brochures. They're just talking features and products. And I heard one of them talking on a call. So they're all in an open area, talking on the call, and they hung up. And the other person beside them said, you were doing exactly what Mike said you shouldn't do. What story could you tell? And they started talking about the story. They started coaching each other in the open area. And she said, that's exactly what I want. I want them to start coaching each other, which is what we do in this, right? And then we do the competition, which is usually 2 weeks after the workshops. Do the competition. And then we create the story bank, and they can see their stories in the story bank. So we create it for them, and they can see their story. They can see the coaching about it. And then they start researching new stories. And after 4 months, they have usually 20 or 30 stories in their story bank, and they're starting to coach each other. And then we can say, see you later. you know what you're doing, right? Maybe we come back, but they're running, they're doing it. They've changed.
No, that's great. The story bank works just great. We have a question right here. It says, if you could choose only one story to use for the rest of your life, which one would it be?
Well, the story I told at the end of going to the mining company has a lot in it, because it has an example of what it's like to be not knowing what to do in sales, and then telling a connection story and getting a connection story and getting the client story and using the client story to change my organization and the client organization and winning the deal. So that story, which probably took me about 3.5 minutes to tell, which is long. That's pretty long for a story. Normally they're 2 minutes. That story, if I only had one story, I might choose that one because I reckon I could sell a lot of story training just with that story.
Yeah, that's a great
What
story.
do you think?
Yeah.
It's a difficult question because, I have lots of favorite stories. And after a while, you need to change your stories as well.
Yeah, I think when you get better and better at storytelling in the sales process, the contrary is what happens. I mean, that's why I laugh, because you start to make a better story bank with lots of stories. So
yes,
why would you choose just one where you can have like a lot of stories working, right?
But in one sense, Azul's question is a good question because not all stories are equal. If you have 30 stories in your story bank, I guess that 3 of them will get told 90% of the time. There's this Pareto effect. We call it
Yeah.
Pareto effect, where some stories are just that much better. Like the example I gave of the Twin Towers evacuation. That story became the story that got told the most in that company. So it is true that some stories are better than others, and sometimes you can't tell ahead of time. You just have to try some different stories and see which ones work.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks a lot, Mike. I don't know if you want to like close.
Well, maybe I can ask you a question, Oscar.
Yeah, of course.
Because you didn't tell so many stories.
Oh, actually, we have another one to you. So, any tips for that time when clients initially rejected your proposal, come back after they hired another company but didn't end well? More about adding value without speaking bad, like a reset.
Okay, so I think I know what's behind this story. So behind this story is I lost the deal and I don't want to let go. Is there some way I can go back and win that deal? So if I'm the sales manager, I'm probably going to say, just let it go and try to find a different client, because the chance of turning around a client that already made the decision to go with another vendor, the chances are low, regardless of how good your story is. But let me tell you a little story about when we did change a client that had gone with our competitor. When I was working in England in the oil and gas industry with Schlumberger, we got a new sales manager. I was the marketing manager at that time. He was a new sales manager, and he came from Houston, and he had just won a deal with Exxon. Was now ExxonMobil, right? So one of the largest oil companies in the world. So you have Pemex in Mexico. I know Exxon is huge. So he had won this deal, and I wanted to know how on earth he won this deal, because they were with our competitor. In fact, they were the number one client of our competitor. And so the first question I had for him is, what's the story? How did you win them back from our competitor? And he said, I didn't think I had any chance, but I decided to just go and meet with the guy who was responsible for software with our competitor, with Exxon. So I started meeting the Exxon guy, and I wasn't trying to sell him anything. I was just trying to find out, how's it going? And this guy started to share stories about how it wasn't going that well. They were having some problems. And our competitor company was not really responding that well to their questions to fix things, right? To fix things. And this guy, his name was Barry. He said to me, Mike, I knew the exact instant that this guy changed his mind to consider using us. I asked him a question. I said, do you think that our competitor, that other company, do you think that they think you have no choice? They think you have no choice, don't they? Because it's very difficult to change software. Once you've gone with a big software system, it's difficult to change. And the Exxon guy thought for a minute, and he said, I could see him getting angry. Yes, they bloody think we don't have a choice. And that's when they decided to change. And it was very difficult for them to change, but they did change. So yes, maybe if you can get your client angry about that other choice, but it's difficult, you know, it's difficult. And Barry was a very good sales guy, and he managed to engage an emotion to get them changed. And all of our decisions, by the way, are emotional. And for a client to change their decision, probably anger is the emotion that might get it to change. So that is my answer to AD is you will need to engage a very strong emotion to get a client to change a decision that they already made, because changing a decision is admitting that you are wrong, and people don't like to admit that they're wrong. Does that, I don't know, what do you think about my answer there? It's a long answer, right, Oscar? I always give long answers.
Actually, there's a second part of the question that, like, adding value without speaking bad of the other part.
And I think in my story, Barry was not speaking badly about them. He was really just asking how it's going, and he was listening for stories about how it's going. But then he kind of put that idea into the client's mind that our competitor is taking advantage of you. You know, they think you can't change. They don't have to respond to you, and he got them angry. But my overwhelming answer to this question is probably better to spend your time on a different client that hasn't chosen your competitor. You know, that's my sales manager answer.
Yeah, exactly. Great.
Good question. I mean, really good question.
Yeah.
And, you know, in all of my selling career, which is now coming on for 25 years, I seldom saw the client change their mind after they already decided on one. It seldom happens.
Yeah.
Can think of not many times.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, Oscar, do you want to tell me a story? I'm going to ask you for a story about when I want to know when you noticed that a story was doing work, that a story was doing extra work for you.
Yeah, I've recently been in a meeting where we were struggling with the client. It was a bank, a pretty big bank here in Mexico, and they had a little budget to spend right now in this crisis, and we were struggling to make him talk. He was talking about other things. He was talking a lot, but about other things. He was like just trying to make us feel good about the situation, like how's your family, and this kind of questions that, you know, he's not getting into the point. So the salesperson that I invited into that reunion, and she was in charge of the client, but I was really accompanying her to the meeting. She suddenly say, "You know what? This reminds me about this other client we're working with right now," and she told a story about a project she was leading in that same moment. It was a project with the other bank, but a very different project. But the client was like pretty interested in hearing, and she didn't say the client, but when she finished telling the story, he said, "I know the client you're talking about. I worked in that bank because I know the details of that case. Thank you for sharing this story. It's an excellent case, and actually, let me talk with you about some problem. Yeah, some other problem I have." And he started opening. He opened up with his boss. The boss already knew us, so it was great. It was a story that opened a lot of conversation, and we haven't closed a deal, but it's a pretty big project, and we have high hopes that we are gonna be doing things with them.
We call it the Crocodile Dundee moment. So, you know, in Crocodile Dundee, the movie, there's like, that's not a knife, this is a knife. I don't know if you know that movie, right? And then you have that enormous knife, right? So you tell a story and the client's thinking, that's not a story, this is a story, right? You know, and then they hit you back with another story.
Exactly.
And that kind of guy is exactly like that. They want to trump your story. Here's a better story, right?
Exactly. And they open up as they never before. It reminded me as the story you open up this episode, like sometimes you need to get people to trust you, right?
They just need to know a little bit about who you are. And salespeople come with low trust. You know, just by the fact that you're a salesperson means, you know, you are low on the trust. You're not a doctor. You're not an ambulance worker. You're just a sales guy, right? You are low. And so who are you? You know, what kind of person are you? And if you can tell a little story that means, okay, you're not bad. You're not as bad as I thought you were going to be. You're okay. I can talk to you. That's that connection, right? And then they say, yeah, well, tell me your story. So stories really help to get across. But what most salespeople do instead, of course, is they ask cheesy sales questions. You know, what keeps you up at night, Oscar? You know,
exactly.
If I could save you 10% of your OPEX by doing this, would you be interested? You know, like, and then boom, no trust.
Exactly.
Yeah, we teach people the wrong thing.
Yeah. I want to. We're almost an hour.
Sorry.
So I want to start. No.
It was stories, right? You tell stories, it goes long.
Exactly. No, it has been great. Thank you. Thanks a lot for being here with us. And I wanted to close in Spanish so that people can better understand.
Maybe make a couple of points. If I could give you a couple of summary points. So the summary is, we're telling stories to get stories. Exchanging stories is the natural conversation for people, right? That's how we want to have our seller-buyer conversation. We want it natural. We do it by exchanging stories. That's my key point.
Okay, great. Sí, entonces, mil gracias de nuevo a todos los que nos estuvieron observando. El resumen aquí es tratar de ser más humana el proceso comercial, tratar de interesarse de verdad por nuestro prospecto, por nuestro cliente, sobre todo en estos tiempos. Creo que me quedo mucho con esta parte de Mike, y esto que dice al final, o sea, tratar de realmente que sea un intercambio, o sea, tratar de escuchar a nuestro cliente, que nos platique historias, y posterior a eso se dará muchísimo más esta magia que todo el mundo estamos buscando en un proceso comercial. Mike, how do people look for us if they want to hire a program for their teams?
Well, your listeners are very intelligent, so they go to Google and they type Mike Adams anecdotes, storytelling, and they will get 1,000 things. They will get the book, they will get the website, they will get and of course your website as well, because you guys are our partners in Mexico, so they can also put Astrolab, right?
Exactly. Sí, si están de esta parte del planeta, lo que tienen que hacer es pues buscarnos, y nosotros con todo gusto podemos armarles un programa para su equipo comercial. Ahora que todos necesitamos pues más fortaleza en nuestro equipo y desarrollar otras habilidades que quizá necesitan incrementar. Creo que este es un extraordinario programa de 4 meses, ya lo dijo Mike. Well, thanks a lot. Gracias a todos por vernos.
Thank you. Thanks, Oscar. Lovely to chat again. Nice to meet your listeners.
Goodbye.
Ciao.